Hi there. What I have here is a nephron, and a nephron can be found in two parts of the kidney. One is in the cortex and another part is the medulla. So some parts of the nephron will be found in the cortex, while some parts will be found in the medulla. The medulla is the triangular part of the kidney right here, while the cortex is the outer part. In this diagram, here we have the lumen of the proximal convoluted tubule. These are the cells that line the proximal convoluted tubule. And this is the basal membrane. In the proximal convoluted tubule, selective reabsorption occurs. Now this is because glucose and amino acids will be reabsorbed into the blood. To initiate the whole process, the sodium ions in the cells lining the proximal convoluted tubule will be actively transported out of the cells into the blood with ATP. When the concentration of the sodium ions in the cells decrease, the higher concentration in the lumen will cause the sodium ions to passively diffuse through the membrane via the co-transporter protein. Glucose and amino acid will also diffuse through the membrane at the same time as the sodium ion via the co-transporter protein. Now this is a secondary active transport. Now this is called the secondary active transport because as sodium ions diffuse into the cell, it will cause the glucose and amino acid molecules to be transported across the membrane into the cells as well. Now the concentration of glucose in the cells is much higher than in the blood, and now it will cause the glucose molecules to diffuse through a transport protein in the basal membrane into the blood from the proximal convoluted cells down concentration gradient. Here is a summary of what happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. This is something that I have obtained and summarized from many sources on the internet, and especially from the marking scheme in A-level past years and the biology course book. Next, we'll move on to the loop of Henle. The sodium and chloride ions are actively transported out of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So this is the descending limb, and this is the ascending limb of the loop of Henle into the tissue fluid surrounding it. Now this will raise the concentration of sodium ions and chloride ions in the tissue fluid, as you can see here and all around here. The ascending limb, however, is impermeable to water and only permeable to sodium ions and chloride ions. So only the sodium ions and the chloride ions will diffuse through it. Now this in turn causes the loss of water from the descending limb, because now the concentration of sodium ions and chloride ions are really high over here, so the water is going to move down from high water potential to low water potential via osmosis. The descending limb is permeable to water, sodium ions, and chloride ions. So water is now drawn out and reabsorbed into the blood by osmosis in the medulla space. The sodium ions and chloride ions in the medulla space now, it will diffuse into the descending limb. Now as you can see, this is all referring to the medulla space. The sodium ions and chloride ions now have a high concentration over here, and it will travel all the way here into the ascending limb, and it will start to diffuse out into the lower concentration that is in the tissue fluid. So now going up the ascending limb, the fluid becomes gradually less concentrated as sodium ions and chloride ions are lost. So higher up ascending the limb, the sodium ions and chloride ions are actively drawn out from the tubule. The fluid becomes more diluted, and then the fluid will enter the distal convoluted tubule. Here's a summary of what happens in the loop of Henle. In the distal convoluted tubule, the sodium ions and chloride ions are actively reabsorbed again into the blood the water is reabsorbed into the blood, and the potassium ions are actively pumped into the tubule. Now, the function of the distal convoluted tubule is similar to the collecting duct, which I will explain with more details in another video. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.